So proceed with lesson 3 of Free Code Camp, responsive web design course. Lesson 3, learn CSS colors by building a set of colored markers. So this is 94 steps. This is what it would look like. It's 3 colored markers. Step 1 is the doc type declaration. So add the doc type HTML declaration and HTML element after that. Give the HTML element a language attribute with EN or English as its value. So doc type HTML, lang. Good. Step 2, nest the head element. So head, after the head, add the body element. Remember that the title element gives search engines extra information about the page, also displays the content of the title in the title bar here and in the browser tab when you hover on it. Even if the tab is not active, once you hover on the tab, the title text is displayed. Okay, title, colored markers. Nice. Alright. The corset attribute specifies the character encoding, UTF, Unicode Transformation Format. Character encoding standard used for electronic communication. Inside the head element, nest a meta element. Meta attribute is corset UTF -8. Okay. Multiple meta elements on a page. Each meta element adds information about the page that cannot be expressed by other HTML elements. So add another meta element within the head and give it a name. So meta name attribute set to viewport, and then content attribute set to width equals device dash width initial dash scale equals 1.0. Nice. Okay, ready to start adding content within the body. Nest in H1 with the text CSS color markers. H1 there. And this project you'll work with an external CSS file to style the page. We've already created these styles at CSS. This one. Nest a link element within the head. Okay, so we'll put link element, rel attribute set to style sheet, and href attribute set to styles.css. Okay. Then, now that your external CSS file is set up, you can start styling the page. As a reminder, here's how to target a paragraph element and align it to the right. So create a new CSS rule that targets H1, and set it text align center. Nice. Now you add some elements that you'll eventually style into color markers. So within the body element, add a div, set its class to container, container. Make sure that the div element is below the h1 element. Okay. Next, within the div element, add another div element and give it a class of marker. Div class equals marker. It's time to add some color to the marker. Remember that one way to add color to an element is to use a color keyword like black, cyan, or yellow. Here's how to target the class FreeCodeCamp. Create a new CSS rule that targets the class marker. So that's dot marker, marker, background color to red. You will not see any changes after adding the CSS. Okay. The background color was applied, but since the marker div element has no content in it, doesn't have any height by default. So in your marker CSS rule, set the height property to 25 pixels and the width property 200 pixels. Okay, so it became this. Your marker would look better if it was centered on the page. An easy way to do is with the margin shorthand property. In the last project, you set the margin area of elements separately with margins with properties like margin top and margin left. The margin shorthand property makes it easy to set multiple margin areas at the same time. So to center your marker on the page, set its margin property to auto. Margin auto. Okay, so it centered. This sets margin top, margin right, margin bottom, and margin left all to auto. Now that you got one marker centered with color, it's time to add the other markers. Container.div, add two more div elements with the class of marker. I'll just copy this. Okay, nice. Well, you have three separate marker div elements. They look like one big rectangle. Should add some space between them to make it easier to see each element. When the sort and margin property has two values, it sets margin top, margin bottom for the first value and margin left and margin right at the second value. So in your marker CSS rule, set the margin to 10px auto. Okay, so there's 10px of margins. To give the markers different colors, you will need to add a unique class to each one. Multiple classes can be added to an element by listing them in the class attribute, separating them with space. For example, the following adds both animal and dog classes to a div element. If you add multiple classes to an HTML element, the styles of the first classes you list may be overridden by later classes. To begin, add class 1 to the first marker div. Next, remove the background color property and its value from the marker CSS rule. Create a new CSS rule targets the class 1, set its background property to the red. Dot 1 background dash color to red. Add the class 2 to the second marker and 3 to the third marker. Create a CSS rule that targets the class 2 background color set to green. Add a separate CSS rule that targets the class 3 background color to blue. Okay, so we now have 3 colored markers. Two main color models, the additive RGB mod used in electronic device and subtractive CMYK in print. So in this project, you'll work with the RGB model. This means that colors begin as black and changes different levels of green and blue are introduced. An easy way to see it, CSS RGB function. So create a new CSS rule, target the class container and set its background color. Container background dash color will set to RGB 000. Uh, Container CSS rule should have a background color. Okay. I have an extra comma. A function is a piece of code that can take an input and perform a specific action. So the CSS RGB function accepts values or arguments for red, green, and blue and produces a color. Each red, green, blue value is a number from 0 to 55. 0 means there's 0 of that color and is black. 255 means there's that 100% of that color. In the one CSS rule, replace the word red with RGB function. For the RGB function, set the value for red to 255, value to 0, and so put RGB, red is 255, 0 for green, and 0 for blue. Okay. Notice that the background color of your marker is still red. This is because you set the red value of the RGB to the max of 255, 100% red. Set both green and blue values to 0. Now use the RGB function to set the other colors. So in the 2CSS rule, use the RGB function to set the background color to the max value for green and 0 for other values. So RGB 0 for red, 255 for green, and then 0 for blue. And then this 3CSS rule, set the background color to the max of blue. Just do RGB 0 for red, 0 for green, 255 for blue. Okay. While the red and blue markers look the same, the green one is much lighter than it was before. This is because the green color keyword is actually a darker shade and is about halfway between black and the maximum value for green. 2CSS rule set the green value in the RGB function to 127. Okay. Now add a little more vertical space between your markers and edge of the container element therein. In the dot container CSS rule, use the shorthand padding property. Padding. Add 10 px to the top and bottom padding and set the left and right padding to 0. This works similarly to shorthand to margins. Okay. So step 26 in the additive RGB color model, primary colors are colors that when combined create pure white. For this to happen, each color needs to be at its highest intensity. For your combined colors, set your green marker back to pure green. So 255. With the primary RGB colors, it's time to combine them. For the RGB function, the container rule, set the red, green, and blue values to 255, 255, 255, 255. Okay, so now it's white. Secondary colors are the colors you get when you combine primary colors. You might have noticed some secondary colors in the last step as you change the red, green, and blue values. To create the first secondary color yellow, or update the RGB function in the one CSS. We'll combine pure red and pure green. So red and green, 255. Yellow. Next secondary color cyan. Update our pure green and pure blue. Green and blue. Okay, so cyan. Then magenta. Blue and red. So it's blue and red. 5. Now that you're familiar with the secondary colors, you'll learn how to create tertiary colors, created by combining a primary with a nearby secondary color. So to create a tertiary color orange, update the RGB function in the one CSS rule. Red is max and set green to 127. Okay, orange. Increase the intensity of red and decrease the intensity of green. It's because the orange is the combination of red and yellow. Create the tertiary color spring green, combine cyan with green. Green is at max value and set blue to 127. This one. Add the color violet, combine magenta with blue. So blue is at the max value, red is 127. Okay. There are 3 more tertiary colors: chartreuse green, which is green plus yellow, azure, blue plus cyan, and rose, red plus magenta. To create chartreuse, red is 127 and green to max value. Red is 127, green is 255. Okay. And then for azure, green is 127, blue is at max value. And for rose, or called bright pink, blue is at 127, red is at max value. Okay. Now that you've gone through all the primary, secondary, and tertiary colors on the color wheel, it will be easier to understand other color theory concepts and how they impact design. So first, in the CSS rules 1, 2, 3, adjust the values so that the background color of each element is set to pure black. So we'll put it to 0. Okay. Color wheel is a circle where similar colors are used are near each other and different ones are further apart. For example, pure red is between the hues rose and orange. Two colors that are opposite from each other on the color wheel are called complementary colors. If two complementary colors are combined, they produce gray. But when they are placed side to side, these colors produce strong visual contrast and appear brighter. So in the RGB function for one CSS rule, set the red value to the max of 255 to produce pure red. For the other two, in the two, green and blue to the max of 255. Notice that the red and cyan colors are very bright right next to each other. This contrast can be distracting if it's overused on a website and can make text hard to read if it's placed on complementary colored background. It's better practice to choose one color as a dominant color and use its complementary color as an accent to bring attention to certain content on the page. So in the H1 rule, set the background color to cyan, ground dash color to cyan. Should cyan is RGB 0255255. In the one CSS rule, use the RGB function, set the background color to black 0. And then 2 CSS rule, RGB function, background color to red. 25500. Okay. Notice how your eyes are naturally drawn to the red color in the center. So when designing a site, you can use this effect to draw attention to important headings, buttons, or links. There are several other important color combinations outside of complementary colors, but you learn those a bit later. For now, use the RGB function in the toCSS rule to set the background color to black 0. Okay, so add and in the H1 CSS rule, remove the background color. Now it's time to add other details to the markers, starting with the first one. In the first div element, change the class 1 to red. Update the 1 sys rule, change it to red. Update the RGB function in the .red CSS rule so that red value is at max. Change the class 2 to green and 3 to blue. Update the CSS class selector 2 so it targets green and 3 to blue. Very common way to apply color to an element with CSS is hexadecimal or hex values. So while hex values sound complicated, they're just another form of RGB. Hex color values start with a hashtag character and take 6 characters from 0 to 9 and 8 to F. So that's hexadecimal. First pair of characters represent red, second pair is green, and third pair is blue. So for example, this one right here. Green class selector set the background to 00, 0. So to hashtag 00 FF00. Okay. You may be familiar with decimal or base 10, which go from 0 to 9. Hexadecimal or base 16 values go from 0 to 9 and 8 to F, like this. So with hex colors, 00 is at 0% of that color, and FF is 100%. So 00 FF00 translate to 0 red, 100 green, and 0 blue. Same as this RGB. So lower the intensity of green by setting the value of the hex color to 7F. 7F. HSL color model or hue, saturation, and lightness is another way to represent colors. HSL function accepts three values, so 0 to 360 for hue, percentage from 0 to 100 for saturation, and 0 to 100 for lightness. If you imagine a color wheel, the hue red is 0, green is 120, and blue is 240. Saturation is the intensity of a color from 0% or gray to 100% for pure. So add the percent sign to the saturation and lightness values. So lightness is how bright a color appears from 0 to complete black to 100% complete white and 50 being neutral. In the blue CSS rule, use the HSL function to change the background color to pure blue. So HSL 240, saturation is 100%, and lightness to 50%. Okay. You learned a few ways to set flat colors in CSS, but you can also use a color transition or gradient on an element. So gradient is when one color transitions into another. CSS linear gradient function lets you control the direction of the transition along a line in which colors are used. One thing to remember is that linear gradient function actually creates an image element and is usually paired with the background property, which can accept an image as value. So in the red CSS rule, change the background color property to background. Okay. The linear gradient function is very flexible. Here's the basic syntax you use in this tutorial. Linear gradient and then the gradient direction, color 1, color 2. This direction is the direction of the line used for the transition. Color 1, color 2 are color arguments, which are colors that will be used in transition. So this can be any type of color, keywords, hex, RGB, or HSL. Apply a red to green gradient along a 90-degree line to the first marker. So this, set the background property to linear gradient, linear dash gradient, and pass it the value 90 degrees, 90 deg as the gradient direction. You'll use the RGB function for the colors of this gradient. In the linear gradient function, use the RGB function to set the first color argument to pure red. RGB red, that's pure red FF 0000. Okay. CSS rule should have a background property with the RGB, not hex. RGB. GB 25500. Okay. You won't see any gradient yet because the linear gradient function needs at least two color arguments to work. So in the same function, use the RGB function to set the second color argument to pure green. RGB 02550. Okay, select this. As you can see, produce a smooth red to green gradient. While the linear gradient function needs a minimum of two color arguments to work, it can accept many color arguments. Use the RGB function to add pure blue as third color argument. Pure blue, it's RGB 00255. Okay, like this. Color stops allow you to fine-tune where colors are placed along the gradient line. They are a length unit like px or percentages that follow along a color and the linear gradient functions. For example, in this red-black gradient, transition from red to black takes place at the 90% point along the gradient line, so red takes up most of the available space. Linear gradient function, add a 75% color stop after the first color argument. So red 90% after the first red color argument. So that's here, 75%. Okay, so it's look like this. And now that you know the basics of how the linear gradient function and color stops, you can use them to make the markers look more realistic. In the linear gradient function, set gradient direction to 180 degrees. 80. Okay. Next, set the color stop for red to 0%. Red is 0%. Color stop for green to 50%. Color stop for blue to 100%. Now that the colors are set, you'll apply different shades of red to each color argument in the linear gradient function. Shades in the top and bottom edges of the marker will be darker, while the one in the middle will be lighter as if there's a light above. First color argument, which is currently pure red, update the RGB function. So the value for red is 122, green is 74, blue is 14. Okay. Modify the second color argument, which is currently green. Update the RGB function. So red is 245, 62, 113. Third color argument, linear gradient is currently blue. Update the RGB function. So value is 162, 27, and 27. Okay, so it looked like this. Red marker is looking much more realistic. Now you'll do the same for the green marker using combination of linear gradient and hex colors. So set this to background. Use hex colors, color codes for gradient. Use the linear gradient function and set the gradient direction to linear dash gradient 180 degrees. Then for the first color argument, use a hex color code with the value of 55, 68, 0D for blue. Okay. For second color argument, use a hex color code with the values 71, F5, and 3E. 71, F5, 3E. I should put this inside. But the bottom edge of the green marker needs to be darker. And the same, add the hex color code with the values for 11, 6C, 31. Right, so next, even with the color stops, you might have noticed that the colors for the green marker transitions at the same points as the red marker. The first color is 0, second is 50, and then it's 100%. Linear gradient function automatically calculates these values for you and places colors evenly along the gradient line by default. So in the CSS rule, remove the 3 color stops from the linear gradient function. Remove this. Remove. If no gradient direction argument is provided, it arranges colors from top to bottom or along a 180-degree line by default. So clean up your code and remove the gradient direction. I applied gradient to the blue marker, this time using the HSL function as color arguments. In the blue CSS rule, change the background color to background. Use the linear gradient function and pass in the HSL function with the values 186, 6, 76%, 16%. Your blue CSS should have a background property with, I'm missing value linear gradient. I'm missing the parentheses. second color argument, 2 to 3 for you, 90% and 60% for Linus. For the second color argument, so let me reset this. Put 2 to 3, 90%, 60%, 76. What am I missing here? Oh, HSL. It's 69 as a third color argument. HSL function values. HSL 240, 56%, and 42%. Markers have the correct colors. It's time to build the marker sleeve. Start with a red marker. Insert the red marker div class equals sleeve div uses rule that targets the class sleeve width is 110 px, height plus 25 px. To make the marker look more realistic, give the sleeve a transparent white color. So background dash color is the white, and then opacity describes how opaque or non-transparent something is. For example, a solid wall is opaque and no light can pass through, but the drinking glass is much more transparent. You can see through the glass to the other side. So CSS opacity property can control how opaque or transparent an element is. The value of 0, it's transparent, and 1.0 or 100%, it's completely opaque. Opacity would be 0.5. Another way to set the opacity is with the alpha channel. So similar to the opacity property, alpha channel controls how transparent or opaque a color is. You've already set sleeve's opacity with name color and opacity property, but you can add an alpha channel to the other CSS color properties. So inside the sleeve property, remove the opacity property and value. You're already familiar with using RGB. So to set an alpha channel, use RGBA function instead. RGBA function works like RGB, but takes one more number from 0 to 1 for the alpha channel. Red, green, blue, and then alpha value. So you can also use an alpha channel with HSL and hex colors. Sleeve will use RGBA to set the background color property to pure white with 50% opacity. RGBA. White is 255, 50%. RGBA 0.5. Your sleeve is looking good, but it would look even better if it was positioned more toward the right side of the marker. One way to do that is add another element for the sleeve to push it to the right. Add a new div element with a cache. Before the sleeve element, we'll put div class equals cap Create a new CSS rule to target the class cap. That cap, new rule set width, property 60px, and then height just 25px. Looks like your sleeve disappeared, but don't worry, it's still there. What happened is that your new cap div is taking up the entire width of your marker and is pushing the sleeve down to the next line. It's because the default display property for div elements is blocked. So when two block elements are next to each other, they stack like actual blocks. For example, your marker elements are all stacked on top of each other. To position two div elements in the same line, set their display properties to inline block. Display inline dash block. Wait. Create a new rule targeting both cap and sleeves. Put that. Dot cap dash sleeve classes and set display to inline block. Display inline dash block. In the last project, you learned a little bit about borders and border colors. All HTML elements are borders, though they're usually set to none by default. CSS, you can control all aspects of an element's border and set the border on all sides or just one side at a time. For a border to be visible, you need to set its width and style. Border dash left dash width 10px. And then borders have several styles to choose from. You can make your border a solid line, but you can also use a dash or dotted line if you prefer. Solid border lines are probably the most common. So in the sleeve rule, add the border left style, border dash left dash style, then put solid. Okay. Uh, Visible now. If no color is set, black is used by default. Set the border color. So border left color is black. Border left lets you set the left border's width, style, and color at the same time. So syntax is width, style, and color. So replace border left width, border left style, border color. So it will be 10px solid black. Border dash left 10px solid black. Nice. Your marker is looking good, but to make it look even more realistic, you can change the border style to double solid borders. For border left shorten property, change the border style from solid to double. Double. Okay. Black color if your border looks pretty harsh against the more transparent sleeve. You can use alpha channel to lower the opacity to the black border. For the border left shorten property, use RGBA function to set the color value to pure black. Uh, Border left color RGBA pure black is 0, 0, 0, and then 0.75. Nice. Your red marker is looking good. Now all you need to do is add caps and sleeve to your other markers. Add a cap and sleeve to both green marker. Uh, Add this and to this. Nice. Just copy the div elements. Right, okay. Next is, lastly, you just add a slight shadow to each marker to make them look even more realistic. So box shadow property lets you apply one or more shadows around an element. Example code is box shadow offset x offset y color. How offset x and offset y values work? Both offset x and offset numbers value in px and other CSS units. Positive moves the shadow right, negative moves it left. Okay, so right, left, then up, down. Value of 0. Don't need to add the unit there, since 0 means no change. Okay, so height and width of the shadow is determined by the height and width of the element it's applied to. You can also use an optional spread radius to spread out the reach of the shadow, or not later. Simple shadow to the right marker. We'll put a box dash shadow. Values 5px for offset x, 5px for offset y, and then red for color. Okay, so it looks like this. As you can see, I added a simple red shadow around your marker. It's 5 pixels to the right and 5 pixels down. But if you want to position your shadow on the opposite side, you can do that by negative. So we can date negative and negative. Okay, so it's on the other side. Notice that the edge of the shadow is sharp. That's because optional blur radius value for the box shadow property. Offset x, offset y, blur radius, and color. If blur radius is not included, it defaults to 0 and produces sharp edges. So higher the value of blur radius, the greater the blurring effect is. So in the green CSS rule, add box dash shadow property values of 5px for offset x, 5px for offset y, 5px for blur radius. Oh, nice. And green for the color. If you wanted to expand the shadow out further, you can do that with spread radius, which is after the blur radius defaults to 0. So practice for adding 5 pixel shadow directly around the blue markers. In the blue CSS rule, add box dash shadow 0 for offset x, 0 for offset y, 0 for blur radius, 5px for spread radius, and blue for the color. Ah, spread radius. Okay. Now that you're familiar with the box shadow property, you can finalize the shadow starting with 1 for the red markers and the red. Update the values for box shadow property. So offset is 0, 0, 0. Blur radius is 20px. Spread radius is 0. And color is red. Don't need to add units to 0 value. So 20px. Ah, okay. No need to add units, just 0. Red. Okay, update the color value for the red markers box shadow property. Replace the name color with the RGBA function. This one, RGBA. Use 83, 14, 14, 0.8. So shadows for green blue markers will have the same position, blur and spread. Only difference will be the colors in the green blue property. So green will put 0, 0, blur radius is 20px, and spread radius 0, color is green. And then I'll copy this here as well. Okay, so for the green markers bulk shadow property, replace the name color with a hex color code. This would be 3B7E20. Oh, CC for the alpha channel. For the blue marker, replace name color with the HSLA function. HSL 223, 59%, 31%, and 0.8 for the alpha channel. Okay. Alright, so I guess that's all done. Let's just check the next lesson. So next lesson is HTML forms by building a registration form.